Hello, and welcome to another day of English 2. I'm your online teacher, Miss Abear. As a reminder, we are working on a literary analysis unit, and this is from a larger unit from Common Lit called Coming of Age. And our essential question for this unit is, what experiences lead us from childhood into adulthood? And at the end of our unit, you are going to write an essay in which you explain your perspective on what it means to come of age and how we become an adult. You're going to use evidence from multiple texts as well as your own experiences to support your argument. Today, before we get started, we're going to be reading a short story called Marigolds. But before we do, I want you to turn and talk with a partner and answer this question. In this unit's text, how do adults and children respond differently to frustrating realities of the world? And do you think that this is accurate based on your experiences? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to turn and talk. Good. I'm glad you guys had those great talks. Those discussions are going to help prepare you to write that essay in the end. And today we're going to hear about some experiences that are going to be a little bit different than the other experiences that we have been looking at. This is a short story called Marigolds. And in Marigolds, a woman reflects on an important moment from her childhood. And before we get too far involved, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. So, this is a story about an African-American community in rural Maryland that has been hit hard by the Great Depression. You may have already gotten some information about the Great Depression from one of your history teachers. And so you'll learn a little bit more or something a little bit different today. But the Great Depression was a period of economic downturn that lasted for 10 years, from 1929 to 1939. And many Americans experienced severe poverty and unemployment during this time. So due to long history of discrimination, African Americans were the first to see their hours and their jobs cut. So this was a pretty substantial time in American history. So I want you to raise your hands and answer the question, how might growing up during a time like the Great Depression impact when and how a person comes of age? It's going to take a little bit of synthesis for you to be thinking about that, but I want you to think about that and then raise your hand to share your answer. Those were some great responses, and I'm glad that you're really processing through what it means to come of age. So today when we read, I want you to analyze the way symbols and specific details develop our understanding of a character. And so that will lead us back to our signposts. So if you remember, our signposts are there to help us analyze those moments, thinking about those contrasts and contradictions, those aha moments, the tough questions, words of the wiser, again and again, and memory moments. As you remember, these will help you identify the theme, the conflict, the plot, will help you predict what's going to happen later on in the story, make connections, and really synthesize your learning. So really want you to think about that as we read the story, and don't forget to mark those signposts as we read. So, the symbolism refers to a word or object that represents something else. Some symbols are universal, while others may be specific to a particular story or situation. So when you think about symbolism, one of the easiest ways to think about symbolism is the American flag. A lot of people look at the American flag as symbolizing freedom in the United States. For others, it has other meanings, but for the most part, the American flag, when we see it, represents freedom. So think about that when you think about symbolism. Marigolds is a story where a black woman reflects on her childhood growing up in rural Maryland during the Great Depression. She remembers one summer when she was starting to come of age and noticing the poverty and frustrations of her world. In this memory, she expresses regret at destroying the one image of beauty that stood out in an otherwise bleak world, Miss Lottie's Marigolds. Okay, so you should have your copy of Marigolds that your teacher should have given you. And remember to mark those signposts as we read. And we're going to pause and answer the questions in the margins just as we have in our other texts. And just like we did the last time, I'm going to start. I'm going to read out loud for you. And then in this passage, you're going to do some partner reading. But I want you to follow along with me as we read. So grab your copy, grab you something to write with, maybe a highlighter as well, and follow along with me as I read this first section of this story. When I think of the hometown of my youth, all that I seem to remember is dust. The brown, crumbly dust of late summer, arid, sterile dust that gets into the eyes and makes them water, gets into the throat and between the toes of bare brown feet. I don't know why I should remember only the dust. Surely there must have been lush green lawns and paved streets under leafy shade trees somewhere in town, but the memory is an abstract painting. It does not present things as they are, but rather as they feel. And so, when I think of that time and that place, I remember only the dry September of the dirt roads and grassless yards of the shanty town where I lived. And one other thing I remember, another incongruency of memory, a brilliant splash of sunny yellow against the dust. Miss Lottie's Marigolds. So for a second, I want you to turn and talk, and I want you to answer that question that's in the right-hand margin. The narrator describes memory as something that does not present things as they are, but rather as they feel. What do her memories suggest she feels about her childhood hometown? So I want you to answer that question in the margin with your neighbor, and we'll come back and read some more. All right, let's come back together and we're going to start on paragraph 2. Whenever the memory of those marigolds flashes across my mind, a strange nostalgia comes with it and remains long after the picture has faded. I feel again the chaotic emotions of adolescence, elusive as smoke, yet as real as the potted geranium before me now. Joy and rage and wild animal gladness and shame become tangled together in the multicolored skein of 14 going on 15 as I recall that devastating moment when I was suddenly more woman than child. Years ago in Miss Lottie's yard. I think of those marigolds at the strangest times. I remember them vividly now as I desperately pass away the time. I suppose that futile waiting was the sorrowful background music of our impoverished little community when I was young. The depression that gripped the nation was no new thing to us, for the black workers of rural Maryland had always been depressed. I don't know what it was that we were waiting for. Certainly not for the prosperity that was just around the corner, for those were white folks' words, which we never believed. Nor did we wait for hard work and thrift to pay off in shining success, as the American dream promised, for we knew better than that too. Perhaps we waited for a miracle, amorphous in concept, but necessary if one were to have the grit to rise before dawn each day and labor in the white man's vineyard until after dark, or to wander about in the September dust, offering one's sweet words in return for some meager share of bread. But God was chary with miracles in those days, and so we waited and waited. We, children, of course, were only vaguely aware of the extent of our poverty. Having no radios, few newspapers, and no magazines, we were somewhat unaware of the world outside of our community. Nowadays, we would be called culturally deprived, and people would write books and hold conferences about us. In those days, everybody we knew was just as hungry and ill-clad as we were. Poverty was the cage in which we were all trapped, and our hatred of it was still the vague, undirected restlessness of the zoo-bred flamingo who knows that creature created him to fly free. As I think of those days, I think most poignantly the tag end of summer, the bright, dry times when we began to have a sense of shortening days and the immense of the cold. All right, there are a couple of questions in your margins of your text, one about paragraph 3 and the other from paragraph 4. So I'm going to let you answer those questions quickly in your margins, and then I will give you your next assignment where we're going from here. All right, your next section of this text is a partner read. And so you're going to read paragraphs 6 through 16, making sure that you answer those questions in the margins. And because this is a partner read, you can also answer those questions with your partner. That's all that we're going to do for today. We're going to come back tomorrow and do another whole class read and finish this story. So I want you, if you have some extra time after you and your partner finish reading, I want you to think about that essential question that we had. And I'm going to go back to it real quick. What experiences lead us from childhood into adulthood? And I really want you to focus on that question as we end for today. Until next time, happy reading.